The Bible versus the Middle East with Indications of the True Promised Land, Volume 1 by Jonathan Machtemes, First Edition, The Obery Project, Publications, 2023. All rights reserved. Authors, Preface. In the interest of the reader spending more time on the material than the pre-material, I will be brief. All Bible quotes herein are from the King James Version, 1769, unless otherwise cited. All Strong's entries are prefaced with either an H for Hebrew or a G for Greek. All pronunciations of Hebrew, or as I most often refer to it herein, Obery, are without the Masorah, therefore as close to a reasonable English rendering as possible. All Obery/Hebrew words presented herein are in an English form, as most Obery glyphs or letters are equivalent to English, i.e. the Aleph as the English A, the Bet as the English B, and the Gimel as the English G. They will mostly be presented as such. English BYT for house, instead of the Hebrew Bet Iad Tav. The exceptions to these single-letter equivalents will be those with compound sounds that have no direct English equivalent, so for the Chet, lowercase c, uppercase h, the Tet, uppercase t, lowercase h, the Tzad, uppercase t, lowercase s, the Quaf, uppercase q, lowercase u, and the Shin, uppercase s, lowercase h. No sin, which in Masoretic Hebrew is a shin with the upper right-hand dot being placed to the left, as this is unnecessary since there is the samek or s. The result will typically be a word most English readers can pronounce upon first glance. For instance, uppercase PRT, pronounced Perit, would be Euphrates, or uppercase Q, lowercase u, uppercase DS, lowercase h, pronounced Kodesh, would be Kadesh. There's also the matter of the reader's likely propensity to become confused when I refer to different Strong's entries as the same word. The reader may take exception to my citations of H951, H1239, and H1241 through 3 being Buker, Bukur, and Bukure, all with varied and quasi-varied definitions as, quote, the same word. The reason for my insistence that these different entries are the same word is because they are, in fact, the same word. The only difference is the designations dictated by Strong's, Gesenius, and the Masoretes, and overwhelmingly the latter. For us to accept the dictations of the Masoretes, determining when a word is pronounced in a certain way and understood in a certain way via late-date textual additions, the nikedot, or dots and dashes, around the words, is for us to believe that they, whomever they are, as there is more myth and tradition than hard evidence of them, were men of high moral ambition without ulterior motives. We must also believe that all their efforts on the text were as inspired as the text itself. All one need do, however, is to count how many times words and phrases such as sometimes, not always, rarely, mostly, or frequently are used in a book of Hebrew grammar in order to get an indication of how remarkably unreliable Hebrew, i.e. Masoretic rules, are. Incidentally, Hebrew itself being a Masoretic pronunciation. Hebrew without the Nakud would be Obery or Oberit. Gesenius and Strong simply follow suit and sometimes make things even worse with their own deviations, which may honestly be from some other set of Masoretic rules than those finally agreed upon and standardized only a short century ago. As with the features of the Middle East not agreeing with the Bible, so too with the Masoretically dictated parsings of words, as well as synonym and homonym creations, in that they do not agree with the God of the Bible being a God of order and sanity. One need not even read the fullness of Genesis chapter 1 before spotting rule-breaking among conjugations, tenses, and use of word affixes. Hebrew, as it stands, is a veritable mess of contradictions. Contradictions that lead back to a lot of eloquently presented but still empty and unnutritious word salads from all of the experts. Therefore, when we witness so many problems within the context of Masoretically dictated grammar rules, we have every reason and just cause to believe that when we see boker as morning and boker as heard in the text, one or both have to at least have the potential for being incorrect. We also have every reason and just cause to assume that whatever those numerous entries of the same word really do mean, it's more likely than not that they all mean the same thing, and that the only real difference would be the context, i.e., spatial or conceptual. The bottom line is, we most certainly should proceed with an understanding that the Masorah, which is the foundation of the lexicons and concordances, is faulty. Very faulty. And in that light, we will not only stand to learn far more about the Bible, but will be far more consistent and reasonable in our application of linguistic principles than the figures who have given us and perpetuate such a flawed and unfulfilling system as is the current body of biblical language and linguistic references are. I believe all else is as straightforward as I was able to make it given the subject matter. I hope all will be greatly enriched and equipped by this volume to go forth and participate in the vigorous criticism that the established Middle East model and Masoretic linguistic system has coming to it. John Machtemes, 2023. Chapter 1. Groundwork. The initial map is a typical representation of the sort of map found within many Bibles in the mid to late 20th century, though most Bible maps are works of great art and typically include liberal quantities of vibrant, often green, colors. Section 1. Early Impressions. Quote, I must studiously and faithfully unlearn a great many things I have somehow absorbed concerning Palestine. I must begin a system of reduction. Like my grapes which the spies bore out of the promised land, I have got everything in Palestine on too large a scale. Some of my ideas were wild enough. The word Palestine always brought to my mind a vague suggestion of a country as large as the United States. I do not know why, but such was the case. I suppose it was because I could not conceive of a small country having so large a history. I think I was a little surprised to find that the Grand Sultan of Turkey was a man of only ordinary size. I must try to reduce my ideas of Palestine to a more reasonable shape. One gets large impressions in boyhood, sometimes which he has to fight against all his life. All these kings. When I used to read that in Sunday school, it suggested to me the several kings of such countries as England, France, Spain, Germany, Russia, etc., arrayed in splendid robes ablaze with jewels, marching in grave procession, with scepters of gold in their hands, and flashing crowns upon their heads. Closed quote. From The Innocents Abroad, Twain, 1875, page 486. I received my first Bible at age 5. It was a small 5x7 King James version, typical of the kind of Bibles given away in churches and church schools. I'd still have that Bible too, but apparently it was lost at some point, perhaps at a church or during a move, or maybe it vanished along with a great many other personal belongings down into an easily accessible large heating duct. Who's to say? The one thing I do remember more vividly than the exact location under the floorboards of the house where that Bible may still be was the map section. At 5 years old, I really did not comprehend the King James English of 1769, but I could comprehend images. From the earliest age, children comprehend images far better than they comprehend words and language. Every time I opened that Bible, as I was enthralled by Bible stories, though I still couldn't read 3 consecutive words, I'd go immediately to the map section. I could read and understand titles such as Canaan in the time of the patriarchs, Mesopotamia, the home of Abraham, Israel's wandering in the wilderness, the conquest of Canaan, the world of the Bible, and so on. These images were then translated into the stories I would hear for many years afterward. Then when I began reading the King's English for myself, the images were still there with me, emblazoned into my thoughts and perceptions of every story within the Bible's pages. The land of the Philistines was the Gaza Strip. The nation of Edom was the stretch from the Dead Sea to the Gulf of Aqaba. Moab was east of the Dead Sea. Tyre and Sidon were in Lebanon. Damascus in Syria, and Israel's wanderings were in the Sinai Peninsula, as well as maybe northwest Arabia. All of these prescribed places work just fine in my general readings of the Bible. If something didn't seem to fit, I just decided it was a detail I did not yet understand, and I would usually just move forward without giving it too much thought. This was until I began reading through a few fringe authors who suggested that Bible events didn't happen in the Middle East at all. This was a bizarre idea. Everything basically fit within the maps, I thought, until a few glaring problems worked their way into my mind and would not leave me alone from that point forward. About this time, someone forwarded me a PDF for a book entitled Britain, the Key to World History by Commons Beaumont. Beaumont, a journalist and editor for such publications as the Daily Mail, not Fringe, theorized in this and other books that Britain was indeed the land in which biblical events occurred. Beaumont even cited some of the locations in the UK which needed to coincide with biblical locations. It was precisely his claims regarding geography that caused me to double down on my own attention paid to such things, and after a great deal of study and cross-referencing, I found that not only was Beaumont wrong about the UK being the land of the Bible, but I was also wrong to believe Palestine and the Middle East could ever be a suitable location either. But how could such things be? Was the Bible all lies? If so, then the architects of such lies would have seen to it that the land of matched the history of. But what we see upon investigation is a land that does not match biblical descriptions, even to the point requiring parties yet unknown to apply radical redefinitions of many words and descriptions found within specifically the Old Testament Hebrew. But again, how or why could this be? What motivation could anyone have to execute one of the greatest frauds the world has ever fallen victim to? I thought the message and chief purpose of the Bible was to save souls. So what need would there be for such great deceit regarding its location? The answer to this becomes clearer the more we attend to the Old Testament. The Old Testament, I must report, has nothing to do with soul saving, but an enormous amount to do with the land and Israel's potential for living within it and expanding based on their behavior. This basic idea is the driving narrative that underscores everything from Genesis chapter 12 through Malachi. Israel was meant to be an example and a blessing to the world, and their prize would be for one, to live at peace with and to know the great Creator God, and secondly, to enjoy the goodness and abundance of such a fine land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If Israel obeyed the law, as per the covenant agreed to at Sinai, H 55:14, they would enjoy the goodness and closeness to Yahweh, H 30:68, and would inherit and keep the great benefits of the abundant and vast land of Canaan. If not, they would suffer the loss of Yahweh and the land, and no matter what, the land aspect of the covenant is always within the narrative of Israel, the effects of their behavior and their destiny. The land of the covenant is one of the core features in the covenant, and therefore is at the heart of the Old Testament's narrative. And a covenant that promises so many terrible curses for disobedience, per Deuteronomy 28, would naturally promise an extremely good and highly sought-after land for obedience, a land we see many nations fighting over, invading and controlling throughout the Old Testament, a land so prized that many kings, soldiers, and common folk have bled and died over it. A land which is to be seen as so valuable that men are willing to deceive not only the descendants of Jacob, but the whole world in regards to Israel's true identity, as well as everyone's true identity. The land's true identity, and of course, its true location. The land was the true prize of obedience to Elohim, or God. It is spoken of so prolifically that we would expect it to be objectively excellent in comparison to all lands. And if so, all peoples, not just the neighbors, would want it. This is the why to the question of deception regarding the land of the Bible. The how and the when must be shelved until a later time, though please understand, the methods regarding these two latter questions, however complicated, are not as complex and difficult as we may first assume. They simply require an intimate knowledge of human behavior and psychology, vast resources, and the patience and persistence to see those tactics through. We happen to be living under the control of just such an empire with all the power, knowledge, resources, and patience to carry such things out. But without evidence, much of what's been claimed so far is mere speculation. Therefore, evidence is the goal herein. Evidence regarding whether or not the Bible could have transpired in the Middle East, and evidence of where it more likely occurred. If the events and locations described happened and once existed in the Middle East, we should expect to find a great deal of overwhelming evidences to this end. Evidence in at least the text as compared with the lands in question. What the reader will find upon conducting their own investigations regarding this topic is a long list of excuses, theories, fakes, frauds, deliberate and or inexplicable alterations of biblical terminology, and an excessive amount of modern technological and cultural engineering being perpetrated in highly skillful ways in order to make it appear as though biblical events took place within the scope of the Middle East model. What we will focus on throughout this volume, more than simply disproving the machinations afoot upholding the Middle East model, is the evidence in the text in comparison to the evidence in the land. Augustine of Hippo is credited with saying, "The truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose. It will defend itself." The reader will find as we proceed that in the Middle East model we are not looking at a lion, not even close, but a sickly mongrel dressed up in the best lion suit wealth and power can afford. The real lion is the Bible itself, in this context the Old Testament in particular, along with observable reality. We will let these lions loose and see if this Augustine was onto something. But before more claims and accusations are made, and before the reader invests the time it will take to absorb this volume in its entirety, it would be good to provide some weighty indications of what is immediately wrong with the Middle East model and why this work is so necessary. Section 2. A good and large land. Quote, "I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey." Closed quote. Exodus 3:8. It is unknown in what version of reality exists in which a comparison of Egypt or its Nile Delta with Palestine sounds anything like what we see above. At the Mediterranean coast, The Nile Delta is about 155 miles wide, and it's the only area in Egypt besides a thin strip along the length of the Nile where a large group, such as Israel were at the time of the Exodus, could hope to feed their flocks and herds. This, of course, is besides the fact that neither Palestine nor Egypt have climates conducive to large-scale ruminant husbandry. If we measure from Cairo itself, the delta is approximately 105 miles south to north and 93 miles long if we begin at its official starting point, 12 miles north of Cairo. The delta is then approximately 7,722 square miles in area. In contrast, all of the state of Israel today, which includes a great deal of desert land extending southward to the Gulf of Aqaba, is still 1,000 square miles shy of the land area contained within the Nile's delta, not the whole of Egypt, just the Nile Delta itself. If we were to subtract all the land that is said to have been occupied by Edom per the Middle East model, and therefore not promised to Israel, we would need to take away another 1,000 square miles. This would then make that good and large land promised by Yahweh about 5,700 square miles, 2,000 square miles smaller than Egypt's Nile Delta alone. The entire country of Egypt is 387,000 square miles, and if we subtract the Sinai Peninsula, it's still 364,000 square miles, compared to, at best, 6,000 square miles? Good and large? Comparatively speaking, there's no reason to believe Israel was leaving one poor or even mediocre stretch of land for another poor stretch of land. Quote, "The land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land make thy father and thy brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen let them dwell." Closed quote, Genesis 47:6. Nor is there reason to believe Goshen was a small, remote, now defunct branch of the Nile, lest we also believe Pharaoh and Joseph were near there as well, and in which great city? Quote, "And thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen, and thou shalt be near unto me." Closed quote from Genesis 45:10. And if they were in some now defunct eastern branch of the Nile, they would certainly know the great extent of all of Egypt. Additionally, if there were a now defunct eastern branch of the Nile before the Aswan High Dam, it would only mean that the delta would be that much larger, thus causing the large part of the description of Palestine to fall even shorter than it already does. The Israelites would then, of course, realize the good part wasn't a reality either, as there is no portion of Palestine that offers anything approaching the fertility of the Nile's delta, even if neither Middle Eastern land is good for flocks and herds, as both, according to the Bible, would need to be. Quote, "And thou shalt be near unto me, thou and thy children and thy children's children, and thy flocks and thy herds, and all that thou hast." Closed quote, Genesis 45:10. If I were taken from a great mansion and promised another great mansion, but instead given a small and poor home, I'd have very serious doubts about the covenant I or my fathers had entered into, and whether I could trust anything else told to me by this God. The promises of curses per the covenant for not keeping the law were severe, and it defies logic that anyone would view this small, uneven, hot land as an acceptable prize in lieu of these potential eventualities that were promised to come if Israel did not keep the law. Quote, "The Lord shall send upon thee cursing, vexation, and rebuke in all that thou settest thy hand unto for to do, until thou be destroyed, and until thou perish quickly, because of the wickedness of thy doings, whereby thou hast forsaken me. The Lord shall make the pestilence cleave unto thee, until he has consumed thee from off the land, whither thou goest to possess it. The Lord shall smite thee with a consumption, and with a fever, and with an inflammation, and with an extreme burning, and with the sword, and with blasting, and with mildew, and they shall pursue thee until thou perish. Closed quote. Deuteronomy 28:20 through 22. The above are only 3 verses out of 54 verses regarding the curses that would befall Israel for not keeping the law. The blessings cover only 14 verses. The prizes, again, were the blessings of Yahweh and the land. And if that land is Palestine, how poor would the other blessings be? There was either something fundamentally wrong with the God making such promises of a good and large land, something very wrong with the brains of the people who took that deal, or something entirely wrong with the purported land said to be that promised to Israel in the context of their covenant with Yahweh. Which is more likely? And incidentally, no one protested in the book of Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, or 1 Chronicles that the land wasn't everything promised once they arrived as per the book of Joshua. Not one solitary, habitually complaining soul said, all those laws to be kept, and all those curses promised for not doing so, and we get sand? Rocks? Sparse vegetation, sparse water, salty, sparse water, and heat. Lots and lots of heat. No one soul ever said that, because Israel was not brought from Egypt to Palestine, but from, first of all, H 47:14, Mitzrim, to H 36:67, Canaan, or Canaan. And no Israelite ever even came near to Palestine, not in the times recorded in the Old Testament. Israel was brought from one good land to another good land, and neither is present in the Middle East model. Section 3. Desertification, Famine, and Curses. The great blanket term appearing to answer so many problems is desertification. And while many voices on the subject choose not to use the term, it is nevertheless implied in the claims of a cursed land. The cursed land idea is also evoked in regards to the brackishness of all the water and even the unbearable heat. But concerning desertification alone, what does Encyclopedia Britannica say about it? Quote, desertification, also called desertization, the process by which natural or human causes reduce the biological productivity of dry lands, being arid and semi-arid lands. Declines in productivity may be the result of climate change, deforestation, overgrazing, poverty, political instability, unsustainable irrigation practices, or combinations of these factors. The concept does not refer to the physical expansion of existing deserts, but rather to the various processes that threaten all dry land ecosystems, including deserts as well as grasslands and scrublands. Closed quote. What cannot be ignored about this definition is the fact that desertification refers to, quote, the various processes that threaten all dry land ecosystems. Therefore, based on official definitions, whether one wishes to claim climate change, deforestation, overgrazing, poverty, political instability, unsustainable irrigation practices, or just good old-fashioned curses, by definition, Desertification is a process said to affect already dry, arid ecosystems. However, the Old Testament has these things to say about Canaan. Quote, a land flowing with milk and honey, closed quote, from Exodus 3:8, 3:17, 13:15, 33:3, Numbers 13:27, 14:8, Deuteronomy 11:9, 26:9, 26:15, 27:3, Jeremiah 11:5, 32:22, and Ezekiel 26. And quote, the land is an exceedingly good land, closed quote, from Numbers 14:7. And quote, it is a good land, closed quote, from Deuteronomy 1:25 and 11:16. And quote, for the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of the valleys and the hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, and thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass. Closed quote. Deuteronomy 8, 7, and 9. And, quote, and they took strong cities and a fat land, and possessed houses full of all goods, wells digged, vineyards and olive yards, and fruit trees in abundance. So they did eat, and were filled, and became fat, and delighted themselves in thy great goodness. Closed quote. Nehemiah 9:25, and quote, and I brought you into a plentiful country to eat the fruit thereof and the goodness thereof. Closed quote, from Jeremiah 2:7. These do not paint the picture of a land that ever existed in any other state than one of abundance. Nor does this sound like a dry land, a hot land, or a sparse land. This sounds like a green, spacious, rich, and temperate land, which is not the sort of land considered in the context of desertification. Even if we entertain such theories such as, quote, Palestine lost all its trees to the Romans, who cut them all down in order to manufacture crosses for execution, closed quote. It doesn't take into account how long it would take to deforest even a small land like Palestine for the purpose of execution crosses, which would certainly need to bear far more trees than people to be crucified if this idea is to have any hope of working. Trees can grow back quite fast if in the right environment. If Rome simply cut down the few trees in Palestine, that would only help illustrate how inadequate Palestine ever was in comparison to the above quotes. This claim also doesn't consider the purported success of Rome as an occupying nation in general for many centuries throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa. An empire's success comes in large part from intelligence and ruining the ecosystems of its colonies while irreparably damaging its relationship with those colonized by way of brutal public torture and death isn't intelligent. But what about the land being cursed, you say? The land never was cursed. Only during brief times were inhabitants of the land cursed by nature. The land itself was never cursed. Quote, cursed shall be the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy kine, and the flocks of thy sheep. Closed quote. Deuteronomy 28:18. This was not to curse the land, but the fruit of the land, as it pertained to the inhabitant of the land, and only temporarily. Quote, the Lord shall make the rain of thy land powder and dust. From heaven shall it come down upon thee, until thou be destroyed. Closed quote, from Deuteronomy 28:24. Again, a temporary curse on the people perpetrated via the land and elements not a curse on the land itself. Quote, "The fruit of thy land and all thy labors shall a nation which thou knowest not eat up." Closed quote, from Deuteronomy 28:33. In these above quotes and so many others regarding curses upon Israel, the people, there is the implication that for any of this to be an issue, the land is normally good and productive. Again, the curse is on the people, not the land. Over and again, Yahweh promises the destruction of crops, sickness and blight on the people, and foreign invaders consuming Israel, Judah's produce. But the land itself, the land was never promised to be anything other than how it is described throughout the Old Testament: good, large, lush, abundant, and sought after. Palestine is not sought after, except as a location for the big deception, not even for the purpose of a road, as so many claim was its great value. Anywhere anyone wanted to go could be gotten to faster, easier, and cheaper by ship or boat than over land, especially rocky Palestine. And if Solomon had a commercial fleet in his own time, as per 1 Kings 9:27 through 28 and 2 Chronicles 8:18, then Hiram, king of Tyre, had a national navy and likely private commercial ships long before Solomon's time. Palestine, once again, bears no resemblance to the Canaan of the Bible, and no curses can be found in the Old Testament or New Testament text proving otherwise. Now, what about famines? Famines can and do happen anywhere and to any land. H4758 robe, R-O-B, translated sometimes as famine and other times as hunger, is only recounted as occurring at various times with many intervening years. There was famine when Abram first arrived in Canaan when he was about 75 years old, as per Genesis 12:10. Then, the next famine cited is when his son Isaac had already fathered Jacob and Esau, as per Genesis 25:26. And Isaac was 60 when he fathered his twin sons. And the famine is cited in the next chapter, Genesis 26:1, after it appears Esau and Jacob had grown to at least young adulthood. So it's safe to say Isaac was at least around 80 years old when the second famine occurred. Since Abraham was 100 when he fathered Isaac, as per Genesis 21:5, and the first famine occurred when Abraham was about 75, and Isaac was at least 60 and likely 80 when the second famine occurred, that safely puts about a century between the two. But even if we narrow it to 80 years between famines, that doesn't indicate a commonly dry situation. The third and final famine in Genesis is the remarkable, unprecedented 7 years in which Yahweh elevates Joseph to Pharaoh's first in command and brings all of Israel into Mitzrim, not Egypt. Since we never hear of anything like this again, it's safe to assume this was an extraordinary event, in part for the purposes mentioned, and certainly wasn't anything approaching commonplace. And through a series of equations, we can also determine how long it was between the second famine mentioned in Genesis and this, the third. Because we know that Jacob was 130 when he came to Mitzrim from Genesis 47:9, and the famine had only been on the land 1 to 3 years, as per Genesis chapter 40 and 41, and that all indications from Genesis chapter 25 tell us Jacob was a young man when the famine came in Genesis 26:1, then once again, we see near to a century between the second and third famine. After these 3 famines recounted in Genesis, the famines become few and far between, and we never get a great deal of detail regarding further famines. But a century between each doesn't indicate a sparse, dry, or hot land. The mere fact that there are discernible famines at all indicates a land that is typically good, green, and lush. Palestine is and always has been on record dry and lacking. If not for all the water purification and desalination systems, water pumping and pipeline systems, irrigation systems, air-conditioned barns for cattle, and imported feed and food, it would be just as barren and bleak as it always has been known to be. Palestine is not cursed. It never was. It just isn't the land of the Bible. No miracles were active rejuvenating Palestine. It's the same land it's always been, only with the lion suit on. The Canaan of the Bible is still good, and always has been good, and large. In fact, it's so good that those who currently control it have spared no expense in making the world believe the Bible took place in Palestine. All those Bibles given away with the colorful, detailed, and costly maps are among the smallest of expenses the overlords of the real Canaan have invested to keep the actual good, large, fruitful, lush, beautiful, resource-rich, blessed land hidden from the knowledge of its people and all people, and perpetually under their control. Section 4. No issue lacking. The topics focused upon in this introduction seemed to be a few vital starting points to be clarified immediately. But so that the readers understand, there exists an extensive list of points and subpoints that must be addressed regarding the disparities between the Bible, Old Testament in particular, and the Middle East model. These points stand both dependently and independently of the chapters appearing in this and future volumes, as much of the material going forward will be focused heavily on comparison between the Bible's text, the Middle East model, and whenever possible, the most likely true location of biblical events. However, to provide the reader with a sense of just how many areas there are problems within, the following list has been provided. Point 1. The sheer number of nations occupying certain areas, such as Palestine, Mesopotamia, the Negev and Sinai Peninsula, the Transjordan and outlying areas. This includes the number of places of civilization, cities, suburbs, and towns, and their locations, which cannot all exist in the Middle East model based on size, topography, geography, and hydrology. Point 2. The curiosity regarding what interest any nation would have in Palestine, and the land distances these nations are said to have traveled over land for little to no documented resources. Point 3. The extensive engineering performed in the Middle East to cause it to be far more hospitable. Dams, clean water systems, irrigation, advanced modern techniques in farming and cattle management, cultural engineering, and propaganda, deliberate economic enrichment, untold sums in aid, and designing and enriching the, quote, bad guys of the Middle East to act as not Israel's, but the Jews' antagonists, thus engineering conflicts and politics, etc. Point 4. Archaeological fallacies and misconceptions. Purported biblical sites that neither agree with the Bible nor offer any conclusive evidence. This includes the Middle East's, Palestine/Israel in particular's, reputation for fakes, the Dead Sea Scrolls and James' ossuary, among many, the lack of evidence for an exodus, and the associations and background of all, quote, discoveries of, quote, biblical artifacts and archaeological sites. And point 5, the impossibility of borders as described in the book of Joshua and elsewhere, as well as doubles employed in many instances, such as Mount Seir, Kadesh, Tyr, and Samaria, and alterations in biblical terminology in order to minimize the radical differences between the Bible's description of Canaan and other areas and the Middle East. This involves the use of questionable materials such as Josephus, Eusebius, Jerome, and other non-secular and secular sources to connect Palestine with the Bible. With these points and so much more in mind as we progress, we will not only discover more about the Bible than we've ever began to imagine, but we will also discover much about our current, quote, reality, and why it's in the state it is in. We will begin to discover far more about real reality than we'd thought possible through a study of the Bible and geography alone. All of the events over the last century or more will culminate into a new and strong worldview that can now make sense out of both the Bible and the world. We will begin to understand that if interested parties are willing to deceive the world regarding where the Bible occurred, then they are also willing to deceive the world regarding when the Bible occurred and who the actual people are who bear the most evidence for being the real children of Jacob, Israel. We will need to go into this with an understanding that in order for a conqueror to assure they won't need to deal with constant strife from the conquered, they must remove from the conquered their ties to their ancestral land, their history, their culture, their language. In other words, their identity. If the land in question were valuable enough and the stakes were high enough, they would erase and alter all knowledge of all the aforementioned traits and possessions from the minds of the entire world. They would have to, need to. All identities would then be forged, erased, and altered. All lands would be changed in name, border, language, and history. Places and peoples would need to be entirely re-identified, and what stubbornly remained in titles and tongues would be twisted into counter-narratives and blended into other tongues, called by other names. All languages would need to be altered from a once logical, coherent form into an illogical mess of arbitrary rules and multilinguistic blends. This holds especially true concerning Hebrew, or to be more correct, Oberi, or Lashon Oberim, the language of the children of Eber, over which another language was contrived in the form of the Masorah. This linguistic alteration would have the effect of obscuring the true nature, sound, and likely look of the original Oberi in order to not only hide many things within the Old Testament, but to hide the identity of the people who still bore the vestiges of the Oberim in language. All history would be altered in especially the actual number of years having passed since biblical times, in particular since the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, two of the last books penned before the coming of H. 3120 Iyun, translated Javan or Greece, more likely the UK, or Iyunland, England, followed by a confederation of Yun and other Euro states, as per Daniel 7, 6-8. There would also be the necessity of adding and subtracting non-existent empires and tribes, i.e. the mythologizing of real historic peoples juxtaposed against the materialization of fantasy peoples and nations. This, in addition to artificially inflating the world's perception of various known peoples and their histories, thereby further confusing who is who, what really is a bona fide empire, and what specific land truly is rich far in excess of all others. What the reader will be faced with as we proceed within this subject is that the world and nearly all its facets cannot be what we've been told. For if the land of the Bible is not the Middle East, but someone had the motive and means to make it appear as such in order to hide the true land of the Bible, what else could they and would they alter in order to achieve and maintain their ends? The volumes ahead, focusing mainly on the land of the Bible, promise the potential of revealing all things regarding the whole world, not only the true land, true people, true times, and organic language found within at least the Old Testament. This and subsequent works promise the true revelation, though it be merely in the current context of the land. The context of the land, recall, is one of the greatest subjects of focus within the entire Old Testament. And who are we to ignore such a great subject? Perhaps if we simply focus on what much of the Old Testament, and therefore Yahweh, the God of, focuses on, we will be greatly rewarded in the process.